All right, so we've already come pretty far in our journey of creating and beautifying this CV website that we have here. But we're no longer really aspiring to be computer science professors. So we're going to have to take a slightly different path. And instead, we want to be hired as web developers. Unfortunately, we're never going to get hired with a website that looks like this. So we have to aspire to greater heights. And we want to create a website that looks and resembles more like a professional personal site with a beautiful interface and a few brief notes about what you can do and how people can contact you. So we're going to pay homage to one of the best personal sites on the internet, which is this website by Sean Halpin. And for the rest of this module, we're going to make a website that looks more similar to this and less similar to our computer science professors' CV websites. So once you're ready, I have a challenge for you. And that is to create a brand new project. So that means you have to create a new folder called CSS My Site, and you have to create an index.html page inside that folder. And then you're going to add all of that HTML boilerplate code that you'll need for any website. And you're going to give your website a title of your name. So mine would be Angela Yu, for example. And then you're going to create a CSS folder and a styles.css file. And then you're going to link up your styles.css file with your HTML file. And you're going to check to make sure that it works by giving your website an ugly blue background color, or whichever other ugly colors you can think of. It's completely up to you. So pause the video now and complete this challenge. So inside Atom, we're going to close off what we were previously working on, be that the CSS Bacon fan site or the HTML personal site. If you've got any of these open, then just right click and remove it from the left-hand pane. Now you're going to go into whichever folder you've decided to store all of your web development projects, and you're going to right click and create a new folder that is going to be called CSS My Site. And you're going to go back to Atom and you're going to add this to the left-hand pane by clicking on Add Project Folder. And the one that we're going to pick is that brand new folder that has nothing contained inside. All right, so here's our brand new project folder. And I'm going to go into it and create a new file. And this is going to be our home page or our index.html. And inside this brand new HTML file, I'm going to add in the HTML boilerplate code just by using autosuggest. And I'm going to give my website a title of my name, which is Angela Yu, that's me. And now I'm going to create a new folder inside this project folder. And it's going to be called CSS. And inside that CSS folder, I'm going to create a new styles.css file. So now I have a style sheet, and I'm going to link it up with my HTML using it as an external style sheet. So I'm going to insert a link that has a relationship of style sheet. Now you can also add a type of text/CSS, but this is optional if you want, and it doesn't really matter if you have it there or not. Now, what does matter though is that you correctly point to where your styles.css exists. So in our case, it exists inside a folder called CSS at the same hierarchical level as our index.html, which is the current file we're inside, and then it's called styles.css. And finally, just to check that everything worked out correctly, let's go inside the body and let's add a background color of, say, blue, which is going to be that pretty awful looking color. But now we can check to make sure that everything worked by right-clicking on the index.html and clicking on copy full path, then going into Chrome and just pasting that into the browser bar. And there we go. This is our brand new beautiful site that is just a blue background. But that means that everything we've done so far has worked out, and you can see our title is showing up here as well. And I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to close down this previous site we had back over here. And we're now going to focus on working on this new site that we're creating. And we're going to try and make it look similar to a professional web designer's personal site. So the first difference that you'll notice between our site and their site is that even in the tab bar, you can see that we've got this little new file icon here, which is kind of devoid of any design. But he's got this cute little icon over here. So how do we get hold of one of those? Well, this is called a favicon or a favorite icon. And the reason it's called that is because back in the olden days, when people were still using shock horror, Internet Explorer number 5, the favicon, or the favorite icon, was an icon that would show up in your browser bar if you were on a website that you had favorited. And a cool side effect of that is that if you were the web developer, you can see how many times did people request to display your favicon, and that would give you an estimate of how many people had bookmarked or favorited your website. But now that doesn't work anymore because the browsers will try to display the favicon for all websites, whether if you've favorited it or not. But it's a nice little touch, and this is something that we want to implement. Now, if you want to do this, just head over to favicon.cc. And here you can create a brand new favicon. Now you can either import an image, maybe of yourself, and it will try to turn it into a very coarse drawing, or you can just simply draw it yourself. So I'm just going to draw one myself, and I'm just going to draw a capital A as best as I can, which is not that well. All right, so here's my favicon. And you can see that this is what it would look like when it's being used. So you can go ahead and refine it however you want to make it look nice. And this is where you really unleash your creative talents. And because I don't have many, then this is what I'm going to go with. So now we can download our favicon, which is in a special format for favicons, which is the ICO, or an icon format. And then I'm going to pull up the folder where I've got my CSS my site that contains my index.html and my CSS folders. And I'm just going to click and drag this newly downloaded favicon into the same folder. And now if you head into Atom, you'll be able to see it in the project navigator as well. And in order to incorporate it to our website, we're going to create a new link, but this link has a different relationship. It's not the style sheet in this case. It's actually just the icon. And the icon is located at the same hierarchical level as our index.html. We just have to put its name down. So the file is called favicon.ico. So now if we hit save and we go over to our browser and go to our site and hit refresh, then you'll see that it now has a pretty little favicon that shows up, which is pretty neat, right? Now, if after doing all of that, you still don't see your favicon, try changing the href of your favicon link to this instead. Add the $v=2, because it might be that your browser has cached a previous version, or it's just trying to create a default one that it's placed there. So if you change this, it should allow your favicon to show up. Now, if we take a look at Sean's site, you can see that it's got a whole bunch of distinct sections which we can scroll through. So how can we do this for our website? Certainly not by using anything that we've done so far, because we haven't been able to do any sort of positioning or layout with our previous CV website. So in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how we can create these blocks inside our website that we can style and make it look something like this. So you'll have that to look forward to, and I'll see you on the next lesson. So in the last lesson, we've started this brand new project where we're going to recreate a professional web designer's personal site, and we're going to make it look as beautiful, if not more beautiful, than what we see here. So we started off strong by adding a favicon to our website, but our website is right now just a blue screen, which is not that professional and not that pretty. So let's go ahead and change it. So head over to Atom, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of that awful background color, and I'm actually going to just delete this entire body section here. And I'm going to begin by having no styles whatsoever, and I'm going to first specify the structure of our website. Let's start off by recreating the content of this top part. So there's what seems to be an H1 and something that's just a paragraph just below it. And then there's a few images, and then we go on to the next part. So let's do that for ours as well. So let's go into the body, and we're going to create an H1 that's going to say, I'm Angela. And after that, we're going to create a paragraph that's just going to say, a programmer. And let's hit save. And let's check it out. So there we go. It looks pretty boring, right? And it looks nothing like this. So the difference here is that, you see, these two parts are kind of grouped together in what might be a box. And if you look at ours, and if I turn on pesticide, which is a really, really useful tool when you're debugging your CSS. Now, you don't need to download it, but if you want to, head over to the lesson where we covered internal CSS, where I showed you step by step how to install pesticide for Chrome. So you can see that what it does is that it highlights all of your HTML elements and essentially all of the boxes that are on screen. So as we mentioned before, essentially all that we're doing when we're using CSS is we're specifying the style for how each of these HTML elements should be displayed. And each HTML element is basically just a box. So you can see that we've got a box up here, which is the H1, and a box down here, which is the paragraph. And that the box that's all around them is actually the body. And using pesticide, you can confirm this by holding down the control button and hovering over each section that you're interested in. So if I hover over here, you can see that this is showing me that it's a paragraph element, and up here is an H1, and in between and all around is the body. And that's what the blue line is. So this can be quite useful. Now, what you might realize now is that we might want to have a box that's around this heading and the paragraph tag that we can expand its height and also push down our text to the center of it. So we can do this in a number of ways, but the way that I'm going to talk about here is an HTML element called the div. So let's go back into our index.html, and I'm going to create a new element called a div. And we're just going to ignore the class for now. This div is a special HTML element that allows us to divide our content up on our website so that we can structure each div separately. Now, by itself, it doesn't do anything. So if I save this div here and I head back over to Chrome and I turn off pesticide and refresh, you can see that nothing, absolutely nothing has changed. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about an HTML element inside our CSS module. And it's because divs, amongst other things, don't do anything unless you use CSS with it. So if we turn on pesticide again, you can see that this top part of the body has now got a little bit thicker of a line. And if you right click on it and try to inspect it, then we can select that div over here inside the Elements tab. And if you scroll this graphic up, you can see that it's showing you that it has a width of 1424 pixels and a height of 0 pixels, which is why we can't see anything. It's something that's 0 pixels high, even though it has a width, so it doesn't appear. Now, what you see up here where it says the outline, now this comes from pesticide, and that's trying to show you where that div exists, even though it has no dimensions. Now, if we turn it off, then that goes away. And this is what our code actually looks like. So in order for that div to have a function, or in order to do anything, we have to use CSS. So let's select that div inside Chrome Developer Tools, and let's specify some CSS for it inside our developer tools. So remember, anything that we specify here doesn't get saved, and its only purpose is for us to experiment and see it live immediately. So let's give it a background color of blue, my favorite color, and you can see nothing has changed, but if I give it a height of, say, 100 pixels, then immediately you can see it now appears. And here is our div. This is where it is. And if you hover over it, that's what's going to be highlighted. And if I turn on pesticide again, you can see now if I hold down control and hover over, you can see that if I turn on control and hover over this section, it's showing you this is the div, this is the H1, and this is the P. So the div is only there for you to structure and divide up your content. So if we wanted our div to perform a similar function to what we've got up here, which is the top part of the content, where he's grouped together a title, a subtitle, and an image, then we can do that using a div. Now, remember what I said before about how the changes that you implement in the Chrome Developer Tools don't persist in your code. So if you check back in Atom, you won't see any extra code being added. And if you refresh this site, then all of those things that you entered inside here will disappear. So that's just for testing, basically. So let's head back to Atom and let's do something with this div. So essentially, a div stands for a content division element. And it basically allows you to split up or divide your content into separate containers or boxes so that you can affect the layout of each box separately. So that you can say that maybe these two things should be grouped together, and I'm going to structure it and style it separately from other content in my website. So divs, as we saw before, can have a height if you specified it using the styles, but it'll also have a height if it has content. So if we go ahead and move our heading and our paragraph inside our div here and hit save, then you'll see that if we bring up the Chrome Developer Tools again, that this div now has a height. It has a height of 76 point something pixels, and that's just enough to fit all the content that's inside, which is the H1 and the paragraph. Now let's give it a permanent background color so that we can see it more easily. And to do that, we have to go into our style sheet. But before we do that, let's go to Color Hunt and find a good color that we might want to use. So I'm actually going to stick to the same color palette I had before, and so maybe something like this. And if we head back into Atom and go into our style sheet, then we can select our div, and we're going to change its background color to that particular hex code. Now if we hit save and we go back to our website and we hit refresh, then you'll see that our div now has a background color, and we can see that box of the div more clearly. Now the strange thing is, why does that div not go all the way to the end on the left and on the top? It sort of stops just about here. Why is that? Well, remember how we said that the browser inserts their own default CSS, the style things. For example, how the horizontal rules should look like, or how the H1s should look like. Well, if you take a look at the body element, then you'll see that there's this user agent style sheet, which we know to be the default styles that are applied by the browser. And you can see that it has a margin of 8 pixels from all the edges. So if we change this, and we can do that just down here by double clicking on it, and then let's enter 0. Now if I hit enter, you'll see that that left margin now disappears. Now you might think that we can do the same thing with the top margin. So if I delete that and hit enter, then you would think that maybe our div would go all the way up to the top, but it doesn't. Now why is that? Well, because there's also default rules for our H1. And as you can see, when I hover over the H1, it already shows you the entire space that it's taking up. And you can see that inside the user agent style sheet, it's got a whole bunch of default styles. For example, it says that it should have a margin before of this amount and a margin after of this amount. So margin before is at the top, margin after is at the bottom. Margin start is on the left, margin end is on the right. So this margin is what is responsible for that little gap that we still have. So if I go ahead and change this to 0, then you can see now our div is now sticking right to the top of the page. Now, as you remember, these changes, whether if I edit it here or if I edit it inside the style section here, so I can say margin right is 0 pixels as well, then I get rid of that right little space. But remember, none of this is permanent. So the challenge for you is to go and implement these styles in order to override the default browser styles and make our div go all the way to all 3 edges, the left, the top, and the right. So pause the video and give that a go. All right, so all we need to do is just to transplant these changes we made here over to our style sheet. So you'll notice that when I select, for example, the heading, and I double click on the margin and I hit 0, then you'll see that it inserts this line of CSS code here, where it says the margin top should be 0 pixels. So I'm just going to do that again for the bottom here. I'm just going to hit 0, and I want you to watch over here what shows up. It's written some more code telling us that the margin bottom should be 0 pixels as well. So we now know what is the CSS that we have to write for our style sheet in order for it to have the same appearance. So let's head over to our style sheet and let's go ahead and select firstly the body element, and we're going to override that 8 pixel margin that it has, and we're just going to say margin is 0. And this means that all 4 sides is going to be set to 0 pixels for its margin property. The other one that we want to change was the H1, and this one we don't really care so much about the other 3 sides. All we care is about the margin top, and we want to set this to 0 pixels. So when it's 0, you don't actually have to specify the unit, so pixels or whatever else it may be. So now go ahead and hit save and head back to our website, and let's close this down and refresh, and you can see that our div now goes to all 3 edges. Now, what is this diagram all about? It's got this margin, border, padding, and all of these things. Well, that's what we're going to dig into in the next lesson, where we talk about the CSS box model. So I'll see you there. Now, we've seen before that every single HTML element on screen is just treated as a box by our CSS. And by styling that box, by changing its height, its width, its margin, its padding, that's how we can determine how our elements can be laid out and how it will show up on screen. So, for example, if we specified a CSS rule that targeted all the images on this I Love Bacon website to say that it should have a width of 100%, all that's going to do is it's going to change the width of that box to 100%, and in the process scales up our image so that it expands to fill the entire width of our screen. And this concept in CSS is lovingly known as the box model. To explain this, let's take a simple div that we've given a background color to. And let's say that this div has a height of 300 pixels and a width of 300 pixels to begin with. Now, if I change the height to 600 pixels, then that div will expand vertically, pushing down any other divs or any other content that's not inside this current container. Now, I can also do the same with the width and make it much wider so that anything that used to be on the right of this current box would get pushed out of the way. Now, you've seen that we can specify these values either as static pixels, so for example here, or we can use percentages. For example, I can say that the width should be 100%, and that refers to 100% of the viewport. Now, the viewport is just the screen that you're viewing the website on. So that could be your laptop screen or your mobile screen or your iPad screen, but this will expand to 100% of whatever that screen size may be. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In addition to the width and the height of an element, you can also specify that it should have a border or not. Now, if you say that the border is going to be a solid border using CSS, then you will see a default 3-pixel border show up around your element. Now, remember that this border doesn't encroach on the size of your element. So if it's 300 pixels by 300 pixels, that blue area is still going to be 300 by 300. But you can expand the border size to say that the border width should be 50 pixels all round. So that's 50 pixels on every single side. So now the width of this entire element is actually much wider, because in addition to 300 pixels width for the original element, so that's the blue part, we've now also got a 50 pixel border on each side, and the entire thing now takes up 400 pixels. Now, instead of specifying a border width for all 4 sides, you can override that border by saying specifically that the border top should only have 0 pixels. Alternatively, you can use the circle shorthand. So it means that we're going around in a circle starting from the top. So the border width starting at the top is going to have 0 pixels at the top, 10 pixels at the right, 20 pixels on the bottom, and 30 pixels on the left. And as you go clockwise, you give your element dimensions that you specify for all 4 sides. And there's other variations around this theme as well, which you'll find in the documentation. Now, let's take this one step further. Let's say that we had some content in our div or in our box. Now, let's say that we had some text, for example. The first thing that we remember is that even if our div or our box had no height and no width, it will have the height and width in order to fit our content. Now, let's say that we didn't like the way that this looked. We want to have a little bit of padding or a little bit of space between the text and the edge of the element or where the border starts. Well, then we can actually specify some padding. And this says that there should be 20 pixels of space on all four edges between the text and the edge of the element. So now our box is even bigger. The padding actually increases the size of your box. Now the final dimension that we can add is the margin. And the margin is a buffer zone, if you will, between the current element and any others that are on screen. So say if I had another element on the right, the margin gives our element a little bit of space between each other outside of the border. And now you can start to see how we can use the margin, the padding, the border, the width and the height to start affecting the layout and the appearance of all of our HTML elements, which, as you remember, at the end of the day are just boxes. So that box model is shown every single time you inspect on an HTML element. And you can see this little diagram in the Chrome Developer Tools every single time you hit inspect. So for example, if I select this div, then this is the current box model. It has no margin, no border, no padding, but it has a width and a height of this amount. Now, if I select the H1, then you can see that this actually has a margin at the bottom, which is 21.4. And that's what's pushing it away from this paragraph element. But the paragraph element also itself has some values. For example, a 16 pixel margin at the top and the bottom. And if I highlight this margin part on the box model, then you can see it show up highlighted in orange on our website. Now, it's pretty easy to edit these values using the box model inside Chrome Developer Tools, and that allows you to quite easily visualize what each of these things are doing. So for example, say if I wanted to give a little bit of padding to the contents inside my div, then I could double click on this padding here, and I could say maybe 20 pixels from the top and 20 pixels from the left. And now you can see that my text, my content rather, is pushed out from the left and from the top. Now, and it adds those rules over here in the styles. Now, instead of doing that, I could also just say, let's give it a 20 pixel padding all around, all four sides. And you'll notice that the background color is now in an area that's much bigger. And by increasing the padding, we've actually increased the size of our element. Now, that's not true for all of these different things. For example, let's add a 20 pixel margin all around our div. Now, the parts that have the background color represents our element, and the margin just takes it away from all the other things around. So in this case, we don't actually have much else around. We've only got the top, the left, and the right of the screen to push it away from. But say if we go back into Atom, and as a challenge, I want you to add 2 more divs below this one. And I want you to give each of these 3 divs a class. So the first one should be the top container, the second one will be called the middle container, and the last one will be called the bottom container. And each of these 2 divs should be a square that has a height of 200 pixels and a width of 200 pixels, and give them each a different background color so that we can differentiate them on our website. And this is what you'll end up with if you complete the challenge. A red and blue div that are sitting on top of each other, and they are 200 pixels wide in width and in height. So pause the video and try to complete the challenge. All right, so how did that go? Well, just below our first div, we're going to go ahead and create 2 more of them. So that's the middle one, and this is the bottom one. We're going to change the class to give it a value so that we can differentiate between them. Now, in this case, feel free to use ID or class, because if we're only going to have 1 top container, 1 middle, and 1 bottom container, we can actually give this an ID or a class. It doesn't really matter all that much in this case. So if we call the top one top container, middle one middle container, and the bottom one bottom container, now we have 3 different divs, and we can now style them inside our CSS separately. So instead of styling all the divs, we're going to instead select the top container. And remember, in order to pick out a class, we have to add a dot in front of that identifier. So for the top container class, and then I'm just going to paste in that background color. Next one is the middle container. And this one is going to have a background color of red. And the final one is the bottom container. And this one's background color will be blue, shall we? Hit save. And as we said, these two containers, because they don't have any content, then that means they won't have any dimensions unless we give it to them. So let's say that the middle container should have a width of 200 pixels wide and a height of 200 pixels as well. So now it's a box, and I'm just going to copy and paste that over to the bottom container as well. Now if we hit save and we take a look, let's get rid of this, hit refresh, then you can see that we've got our top div over here, a red square and a blue square, all showing up on screen. Now, if we right click and pull up the Chrome Developer Tools once more, then you can see that we can play around with all of these properties only using the Chrome Developer Tools. So for example, if I select my top container and I change the height to say 200 pixels, making it a little bit bigger, and change its width also to 200 pixels, making it look a bit more like the other two squares. I can also add a bit of padding. So let's give it 20 pixels of padding around all four edges. And you can see that this hasn't changed the height or width. The height and width are still 200 by 200, but now it has 20 pixels of padding all around it, making the entire element that has that background color look a lot bigger than what it used to be, because we've just added 40 pixels to the width and the height. Now, what if we add a 10 pixel solid border? Then you can see that that border hasn't affected the size of the part that has a blue background color, but it has made this whole element even larger. And now our height is 200 plus 30 pixels each side. So it's actually 260 pixels height and 260 pixels wide. Now, what if I add a little bit of margin to this? Let's say we have a 10 pixel margin around all four sides. Now, the margin doesn't affect the height or the width or any of the other previous values. And it doesn't even change the part of the element that has the background color. It just gives it a little bit of space away from the other elements, and it pushes them away so that they're not sticking to this current container or this current div. Now, in order to better understand this idea of the box model, here's a demo that shows it from a 3D point of view. So as you see me drag the perspective, where you can actually see that box model as it turns to the side, and it shows you which parts are the padding, which parts will get filled with the background image, which parts will end up with the background color, and which parts the content would go. So this is a neat tool to just toggle around and just wrap your head around this idea of the box model, because it is a little bit weird that when you have padding, it only pads the content, but not things like the background image or the background color. So if you want, take a moment here, just pause the video, replay this part a few times, and get your head around this idea of the CSS box model and how it's formed. Now, once you've done that, I've got a challenge for you. I want you to use the Chrome Developer Tools. So don't edit the styles inside Atom, but instead just make temporary changes to the website so that you can change the margins, the borders, the paddings. Now, the only thing that's not going to change is the height and width of these divs or these boxes. But I want you to create a design that looks like this. So you're going to have that first box right towards the edge of the top and the left of the web page. Then you're going to have the two other boxes that touch corner to corner. And this second one is going to have a 20 pixel border. And the third one is going to have a 10 pixel border. And you can change the color to match the scheme as well. But the main thing is that the corners must touch each other. And I want you to use a combination of margins, padding, border, whatever it may be in order to achieve this design. So pause the video now and give it a go. All right, so what you might realize is that this involves a little bit of maths. So firstly, I'm going to switch my Chrome browser tool to make it go on the right side so I can look at this while I'm editing my CSS code and look at the box at the same time. So the first thing was that we wanted the top div to also be 200 pixels by 200 pixels. There we go, we've got our square. So we now have 3 squares, but we need the first one to have a 10 pixel border. So border, solid, and let's give it 20 pixels of padding around all 4 edges. All right, so on to the next part. Our middle box is red and it has a 20 pixel solid border. So let's go ahead and select the middle container, and we're going to give it a border that is going to be solid and 20 pixels all around. But now we have to make this second box touch with the first box edge to edge. So this actually involves a little bit of calculating. So if we go back to that first box, we can see that its width is calculated by all of these numbers. So it's 200 pixels in terms of the content, then 20 pixels either side, so add 40 for the padding, then add another 20 for the border, and the margin is 0. So that's actually 200 plus 40 plus 20, which is 260. So that means that if our second div had a left margin of 260 pixels, then it will touch edge to edge with that first box. So if this challenge has baffled you up till now, then pause the video now that you've seen this little hint and try to do the same thing for the last box, making sure that you've implemented exactly what we wanted for the dimensions and the layout. But if you want to follow along with me, that's also cool. So first things first, this one is yellow, ours is blue, doesn't really matter, but we can change it over. So we're going to select our last div and we're going to change the background color to yellow or gold or whichever color you want. And then we're going to give it a border of 10 pixels solid. So we're going to say border solid 10 pixels all around. And now we have to calculate how far we need to push this square in order to make it touch corner to corner with this red box. So we remember that this was 260 pixels wide, calculating, adding all of these border padding and width together. And this one has a content of 200 pixels wide. It has no padding, but it has a 20 pixel border left and right. So in total, that's 240 in width. So 240 plus 260 is 500. So if we select our last div and we give it a margin left, so we can either type it out or we can select it inside the box model. But if we make this one 500 pixels margin left, then you'll see that the corners now all touch each other and we have exactly the same design as we've got over here. Now, how did that go? If that was confusing at all, then make sure you play around more with the Chrome developer tools, either through changing everything in the box model here, or by adding in new style rules through the CSS inside Chrome developer tools. But make sure that you can get these things to be pushed left and right and top and bottom and make it look the way that you want it to. Now, if you want the boxes to line up one after the other on the same horizontal plane, then that's a little bit more difficult, and we're going to come to that very, very shortly. So don't beat yourself up if you can't do that, but you should be able to move it top and bottom and add the padding at the borders and make the content look the way you want it to. But once you're done, hit refresh and all of that work goes away, but we're back to where we are and we can continue beautifying our website and giving it a proper modern design. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about the CSS display property so that we can start to understand how the positioning of elements work on screen. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. All right, so our website is still looking a little bit sparse, and in fact, it's looking nothing like this, is it? But we're going to change that very, very quickly. Let's go ahead and add the rest of the content in order to have all the images that we need for our top section. Now, in this lesson, if you look at the resources, you'll find a zip file that you can download. And once you extract that zip file, you should now have a folder called CSS My Site Images. Now, if you double click on this folder, you'll see two images. One is a cloud and another is a mountain. And we're going to try and recreate the scene that they've got over here. So let's go ahead and add those images to our project folder. So if you pull up Atom and find your project folder, then we're going to go and create a new folder in here called Images. And inside this images folder is where we're going to drag and drop those two PNGs, the cloud and the mountain. So we're going to put it inside here so that we can use it inside our website. So now we're going to go ahead and add our images so that we have a image of a cloud at the top of our top container. So the source will be images/cloud.png, and the alt text will just be cloud image. And we're going to have another cloud below this paragraph tag. And finally, we're going to have an image of our mountain right at the bottom. So that will be images/mountain.png, and the alt text will just be mountain image. All right, let's hit save and let's refresh to see what our page looks like right now. Now, it looks a little bit weird, right? Why is it that this cloud is taking up its own line and it's not next to either this heading or this paragraph tag, but this cloud is on the same line and next to this mountain image? What is going on here? Well, to understand this, we have to look at the CSS display property. Now, the display property has 4 different values, and we're going to look at them in turn and see what each one of these does. Now, if we switch on pesticide again, you can see that the box around the cloud is only as large as the image, as is the box around the mountain and this cloud. But the box around the H1 and also the paragraph element, they're as long as the width of the page. So what's going on here? Well, by default, some elements are what's called block display. For example, this H1 and this paragraph tag. And block elements are those that take up essentially the whole width of the screen on a web page. So effectively blocking out any other elements from sitting next to it on the left or on the right. Now, the most common block elements that we would have seen already are our paragraphs, our headers, so H1 through to H6, our divs, our lists and list items, as well as forms. And if we head over to CodePen, and I'm just going to create a new anonymous pen. Let me just get rid of the JS editor, and I'm going to have my view with my editors on the right. So now I'm going to go ahead and create 2 block elements. So we know that paragraphs are block elements. So let's create a paragraph called hello, another one called world. Now, if I select the paragraph tag in my CSS and I give them both a background color of, say, red, then you can see that the entire paragraph takes up the whole width of the web page. So it's blocking any other element from being on the same line next to it on the right or on the left. Now, here's a related problem. Say if I wanted to look at this paragraph tag, which we now know to be a block element. What if I wanted to style the pro part of it differently from the rest of the words in this paragraph tag? How can I only target one part of this paragraph tag? How can I say, for example, underline the word pro so that it says a programmer, but style these 3 characters differently? Well, some of you might think that I could just split up this sentence into 3 paragraph tags. So what if it was a plus a space, then it was pro, and then it was grammar. A programmer. So now I've got this separate paragraph tag for the word pro, and I can give it a class of, say, just the word pro, and I can go into styles and style it differently from the others. So I can say .pro, and this one, if you do a little bit of research on Google, you'll find that in order to make it underlined, you just have to change the text decoration to underline. Now, what happens in this case? Let's check it out. You can see that because the paragraph element are blocking elements, they take up the entire width and they block everything else from being on the same line as themselves. This doesn't actually work. Even though we've been able to target just one part of that line, we can't have it looking like this. So let me show you the solution. Instead of having 3 paragraph tags, so let's just undo this to where we were before. We've got a single paragraph element. What we can do is we can use another HTML element called a span. And inside the span, we can add that word pro, and we can give that span a class of pro. And because we've already selected that class in CSS and we're making that part underlined, then that is going to be applied to the word in this span. Now, if we hit save and we refresh, you can see that we've achieved what we set out to do. And this sentence is still on the same line. Now, why is that? If we switch on pesticide once more, and I hold down the control key, you can see that over here, I'm hovering over the entire paragraph element. But one part of it has a span, and this allows us to select, almost like as if you would highlight a section of your text. Just select one part of the text in order to format it or style it differently. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this here instead of inside the HTML module is because spans like divs don't do very much unless they're used in conjunction with CSS. But another reason why I'm showing it to you now is because the span element is what's known as an inline display element. So unlike block display elements, for example, the heading and also the paragraph element, an inline display element only takes up as much space as it needs to in the height and in its width. So you can see that the box around the span is only as large as it needs to be, as is the box around our cloud and also our mountain. So some of the common inline elements that you're going to come across are things like spans, image elements, and also your anchor tags. If you think back to our CV website that we created in our HTML module, the links for our hobbies website and our contact me website, they show up next to each other. And this is because they are inline elements and they do not block other elements from occurring on the same line. In fact, they encourage them to. And so this is why they're called inline elements. Now, if we head back into our code pen and we create another span. Now, while you can have spans that are nested inside paragraph tags or H1s or whatever else it may be, you can also have them as standalones. But you can see here, if we select our span element and we also give it a background color, then you can see that these elements are in line. And even if we had a whole bunch more of these spans, they would continue to be stacked onto the same line until we run out of space horizontally. Now, you might wonder, why would we ever use block elements if we can simply use inline elements? Surely it seems far more flexible. Well, there's just one problem. With inline elements, you can't actually change the width. So if I said the width of all the spans should be 100 pixels, you can see that absolutely nothing happens. But if I specify a width, the same width, to our block elements, then you can see that it complies very eagerly. But it still doesn't let any other element sit on the same line. So what can you do? Well, you can actually change the display property of any given element. So I can make a paragraph element, which we know is by default a block element. I can change its display value to inline. And that makes all of our paragraphs inline elements and allows everything to sit next to each other on the same line. But you can see we've just lost the ability to change its width. Now, similarly, I can change the display property of our inline elements to block elements. And this allows me to change its width, but it doesn't let them sit on the same line. So what should I do if I wanted elements that can occupy the same line, but at the same time I can set their widths? Which one should I choose then? Well, you don't actually have to choose, because there is another type of display, which is called the inline block. And this kind of gives you the best of both worlds. So if instead of changing the paragraph element to inline, I'm going to change it to inline dash block, then you'll see that not only am I allowed to change its width, you can see that it's now 100 pixels wide, but I'm also able to make them go onto the same line. So act almost like inline elements. And this is kind of what image elements are like by default. Now, I say kind of because, as always, reality is much more complex than that. But if you're interested, I'll provide a link to more discussion around this. But for our purposes, we're just going to treat images as if they are inline block elements, because we're able to change its width and height to whatever it is that we desire, and they also get displayed as if they're inline elements next to each other. So we've now covered 3 out of the 4 display values that we have access to. The last one is simply display none, and that just gets rid of our element. So let's head back into our code pen, and I'm going to give our second paragraph element a separate class. I'm going to call this second p, and I'm going to target it down here, dot second p, and I'm going to set its display value to none. And you can see what that does is that it simply removes that element from the website as if it didn't exist. So if I get rid of this display block and allow our spans to continue being inline elements, you can see that there's no gap between the first hello and the second hello. That world paragraph has now completely disappeared out of the flow of the document as if it never was written inside the code. It's almost like I've just gone ahead and deleted it from the HTML. But of course I haven't. And all that I've done is just set its display value to none. Now, when you're trying to figure out how to hide things on your web page, for example, if you had a quiz, then you might want to hide and show the answer. There's 2 ways that you can do this. One is display none, as you've seen here, which takes that element out of the flow and it's as if it never existed. The other one is a property called visibility. And this you can set to hidden. And what this does is that it makes that element disappear, but it keeps its original position and all the other elements still flow around it as if it's still there. It just can't be seen anymore. So whenever you're trying to make things disappear or reappear, think about what effect you want to have and choose between these 2 properties. So as we've seen in this lesson, the position of elements on screen are determined by many things. The box model, the margins, the size of the border, the size of the width and the height of the actual element, whether if it's display block or whether if it's display inline, whether if we're allowed to set its width or if we're not. But even before CSS comes into play, you have to remember that there's already rules that govern how your HTML elements should be displayed on screen. So to learn about that and to learn more about CSS positioning, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we could change the display property using CSS in order to change the way that our elements stacked against each other. Now, in this lesson, we're going to explore CSS positioning in more detail. But before we do so, the first thing we have to realize is that even without CSS, your HTML element already has predefined rules for how it should be displayed on your web page, even if you don't have any CSS. And we have to understand how things get positioned by default before we can go on to change it, to bend it to our will without getting confused and getting stuck. So let's take a look at these rules. So let's go through those rules quickly. The first rule is that content is everything. Now we know that inline elements only take up as much width and as much height as the content. So if you have a span that contains a long word, then it has a large width. If you have a span that contains a short word, then it has a short width. And with block elements, even though they take up 100% of the width, the height is still determined by the content. So if you have a really super large font for your H1 or for your paragraph, then that box model is going to take up a lot more height than if it was a smaller font. So your content is the first thing that determines how large things gets displayed and what the height and the width will be. And this is despite any CSS. The next thing to remember is that the order of your elements on screen comes from your HTML code. So in this case, we have an H1, 3 paragraphs, then an image. This is how we've written our code in our HTML file, and this is how it gets rendered in that order. Now, if we change the order and put the image at the top of our code file, then our website is going to display in a corresponding way. So the default layout order is determined by your code. The third thing we need to know is that children sit on top of parents. What do I mean by that? So here on the left, I've got a div that's colored in red. Now, if inside this div, I add an h1 with some text, then that h1 is going to be on top of the div. So it's more towards the viewer and away from the screen. So this kind of introduces the concept of the z-index. We know that on screen we have an x and a y axis, but there's also a z-axis, and that determines which element will be displayed on the other one. Because if in this case the div was in front of the h1, then we wouldn't see the h1 at all. So by default, all HTML elements that are children, they will sit on top of the parent element. So if we modify this code even further and we add a span nested inside that h1, then the word inside the span is going to be on top of the h1. So we have three elements here on screen so far: a div, an h1, and a span. And going from the screen towards the viewer, we first have the div, then the h1, then the span. From top to the bottom of the hierarchy, it comes closer and closer towards the viewer. So these three are the default rules for how things get rendered on screen, just based on your HTML code. Now, you can also set a CSS property, which is the position property, in order to position elements on screen the way that you want it to, instead of just going along with the default layout. And in most cases, you're going to want to make changes to the default layout. So let's look at some of the ways in which we can change this position property. Now, these are the four that I'm going to talk about. And the first one, the static position, we've actually already talked about it. All HTML elements are static in their position by default. And static just means go along with the HTML rules and keep to the default HTML flow. And that is what we see when we just have HTML without any CSS, or if we don't change this position property at all. Now, the next one is called the relative positioning. And what this allows us to do is to position the element that we select relative to how it would have been positioned had it been static. So in this case, on the left, we've got our Bacon fan site, and this is just the normal HTML flow. The image is being shown to the left, and it's below all the other elements, abiding by those three rules for HTML flow that we mentioned before. Now, if we select that image element and we change its position property to relative instead of static, which is the default, remember, and in addition to that, we say it should be pushed 30 pixels from the left of the previous position. This is how our image will end up being positioned. So whereas the left edge of our image used to be here, and that would have been its natural position, abiding by the HTML flow, now we're saying give that image 30 pixels of space between its left edge and where the left edge used to be. And there's four of these coordinate properties: the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. And we can set values for them in order to determine how we want to move our element. So let's say that we've got an image that is positioned using relative layout. Then we set the top coordinate property to 20 pixels. That means it will get moved down by 20 pixels. And if we change the left property 20 pixels, then it'll get pushed right 20 pixels. If we change the right property 20 pixels, it'll get pushed left 20 pixels, and the bottom property as well. Now, there's two important things that you have to remember when you're dealing with relative positioning. The first thing is that when you move an element that has a relative position, say in this case we're pushing it down by 50 pixels, it doesn't affect the position of anything else on screen. It's as if the old position was kept and everything else just flows around it as if it was never moved. It's almost like this element left the ghost of itself where it used to be in order for all the other elements to keep their own positions. Now, the other thing to remember is that when we change the coordinate properties, for example, in this case, we're saying make the top coordinate property for this relatively positioned image 50 pixels. What that really means is that we're taking the top of where that image used to be and we're giving it a 50 pixel margin from the top of our current image. So if you think back to the box model, when we spoke about margins, this is the best way of thinking about these coordinates, because very often students tend to ask, if it's top 50, why is it not going up by 50? And why is it instead going down? And what is it top relative to? So if you get confused, have a look back at this video. So inside this code pen, I've created 3 divs that are colored red, blue, and yellow. And they each have a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels. So essentially 3 squares inside a body element. I want to show you what changing the red div's position from static, which it currently is by default, to relative does. Now, by itself, changing this position property does nothing. It only starts doing something when you use one of the coordinate properties like left. So let's push it 20 pixels from the left. You can see that it just got nudged 20 pixels from the left of where it used to be. Now I can also move it all the way to the right by saying something like left 600 pixels. So it's now got a margin between the left edge of where it used to be and the current left edge of 600 pixels. Now, if I say right 200 pixels, can you predict what will happen to my red square? So let's take a look, see if you got it right. So our red square has completely disappeared off the screen. Now, why is that? Well, because the previous right edge was here. And to have a margin between the current right edge and the previous right edge of 200 pixels pushes our red square all the way over to the left that you can't see it anymore. Now, some people might have thought that by saying right 200 pixels, then it should be somewhere around here because this is the right edge of the screen. But as we mentioned, the relative positioning is relative to where the element would have been displayed if it was just following the natural HTML flow. So it would have been here. And now there's a margin between its previous right edge and its current right edge of 200 pixels. But remember, as we said, that the relative positioning doesn't affect any other element on screen. So if I said top 50 pixels, it pushes it down by 50 pixels, but it doesn't affect the layout of any other element on screen. It doesn't, for example, push this blue square downwards or any other element. It's as if the ghost of the red square's past has stayed where it used to be, and it's only this newer version that's being moved around. So there's a lot of new concepts here, and before we move on, I just want to make sure that you're comfortable with this idea of relative positioning. So as a challenge, I want you to change the display property of the blue and the yellow squares so that they will show up in a row where we've got the red square, the blue square, and the yellow square. And then I want you to move the red square to the right of the yellow square. And this is what you should end up with. Now, don't worry too much about the gaps between the squares. It's more important that you get the order right. So they're all on the same line, and it's blue, then yellow, then red. And you should be able to see most of the square. All right, so did you manage to do it? So the first thing that we needed to change was the display property of all 3 elements. So we're going to change it to inline block, so that we can still change its width, but also have them show up in line. So let's add that line of code to all 3 divs. So now they're in the same line. So I want to get rid of this top and make them line up properly. But I now want to nudge the blue square to the position of the red square. So I'm going to make its position relative to where it should be, and I'm going to give it a right margin of 100 pixels. And I'm going to do the same thing to our yellow square. So I'm going to change its position to relative and also give it a right margin from its previous position to 100 pixels. And that nudges it left. Now, the final thing I have to do is to move the red square to the right by 200 pixels. So I can change its left margin to 200 pixels, and that moves the red square over to the right. Now, the reason why the spaces between our squares are inconsistent is because by making it an inline block, there's actually a little bit of space that gets added in by the browser. So we can see that if we get rid of all the position code, there's just a slight smudge of a space between each of the inline block elements. And that's what's making our gaps slightly inconsistent. But the important thing is that you manage to get the order of the blocks correct. So if you manage to get the squares to line up in this order, then that means you've successfully completed the challenge. In order to get the position more fine-tuned, we're going to look at different ways in the future. Now, in the next lesson, I want to show you another way of positioning your elements by using absolute positions. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we can give our elements a relative position. So that's a position that's relative to where the element would have been had we followed the natural HTML flow. So for example, in this case, by making the image 30 pixels from the right relative to its previous position, then we're basically saying that there should be a right margin between the image and where it used to be in the value of 30 pixels. Now I want to talk about a different way of positioning, which is using the absolute position. So in this case, I've got an image that's inside a div. So the div is colored red and it has a relative position. Now our image is nested inside that div and I've given it an absolute position. Now, if I change the right coordinate property to 30 pixels, it's not going to shift left by 30 pixels. No, in fact, it's going to shift to the right of the screen. And this is because with absolute positioning, we are positioning the element, so in this case, the image element, relative to its parent. And in this case, its parent is that red div. So we now have added a right margin of 30 pixels between the image element and the parent div. Now, admittedly, the naming is a little bit confusing, as I would have probably called absolute positioning relative positioning, because we're always specifying a margin that's relative to its parent. But I think the reason why they called it absolute position is because in most cases, the parent is simply the entire body of the web page. So the position, when you're using absolute positioning, looks like you're giving it a margin relative to the entire page, which looks like you're changing the absolute position of it. But don't get confused about the naming. Just remember that relative positioning means that you're adding a margin relative to where the element should have been. But absolute position means that you're adding a margin to its parent element. So in this case, we've still got our three divs inside a parent element, that's the body element. Now let's get rid of our display and our position for all of our divs, so that we now have three squares that are stacked vertically on top of each other, which are all block elements, so they are resting on different lines. Now, if I set the position of my first red square to absolute, and I give it a left margin of, say, 200 pixels, the first thing that you notice is that by using absolute positioning, it does affect the flow of your HTML. So unlike when we used relative positioning, where we left behind some sort of ghost element, where it still kept the positions of everything else the same. But when you're using absolute positioning, you're actually taking the element out of the flow of the document, and it's no longer considered a part of the natural flow of the document. So that's why the blue square and the yellow square have shifted up, because it's as if I've just gone and deleted that div. Basically, red is now dead to blue and yellow. It's like as if they never had a friendship before. But the cool thing is that I can now move this red square anywhere on screen relative to its parent, which is the entire body. So for example, I could say right 20 pixels, and that will just give it a right margin of 20 pixels from the right of its parent, which is the body. And so, as a challenge, I want you to complete exactly the same task, but it's going to be a little bit different this time. Now, this is what you're aiming for. You're aiming for 3 squares, still 100 pixel by 100 pixel, that are touching each other corner to corner. And this time, I want you to make it pixel perfect. So they are right up next to each other, touching each other exactly on their corners. And it should be yellow, then blue, then red. And you're going to use the absolute position system in order to do this. So pause the video and give it a go now. So in order to achieve the design that we want, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add position absolute to all of our divs. Now, the yellow is almost exactly where it's meant to be, apart from one slight problem. And this was a bit of a trick question in there to see if you remembered what we did before. You can see that we're trying to get the yellow to touch with the left and the top edge. Now, I appreciate it's a little bit difficult to see because of how bright that yellow is. But if you look carefully, you can see that there's definitely a margin there between the yellow and the edge of the screen. And the reason for that is because, remember, everything is nested inside our HTML body, and our browser has default CSS rules for the body, and we have to get rid of those if we want to have no margin. So let's first target the body and set the margin to be 0 around all 4 sides so that our yellow square can touch the edge. And that makes our maths a little bit easier when we're trying to figure out how to get the squares touching corner to corner. So we've got a yellow in the right position. The next thing is the blue. So if we're positioning the blue square relative to the parent, which is the body, then all we need to do is give it a left margin of 100 pixels and a top margin of 100 pixels. And now blue is touching yellow corner to corner. And finally, we can go to our red and we can change its top margin to 200 pixels and its left margin to 200 pixels. And we are now pixel perfect with our solution. And we've created the design that we wanted. So how did that go? You would have noticed that it's a lot easier moving things around using absolute positioning when you're just thinking about it being relative to the body. And in this case, if you wanted your squares to be touching each other, pixel perfect, with no space between them, then it's very, very easy to do. Because in this case, all 3 elements are positioning themselves relative to the same thing, which is the body of the web page, and not to different things like where they used to be. And this is usually a much easier way for people to think about layout. Although in most cases, you will find yourself using maybe a combination of both, especially when you want to keep the other elements on screen still in the same flow as what it used to be before you started positioning one element. So they're both really, really useful, and you'll see both of them really commonly across website CSS. Now, one thing to remember is that the parent doesn't always have to be the body. It can also be the closest parent that has a relative layout. So, for example, if we put another div around our red square and we set its position, so this is called container, we set its position to be relative and we don't change it, we're not going to touch it. But this sets up this container to be a perfect parent for our absolute positioning. So let's give it a width of, say, 300 pixels, height of 300 pixels, and let's give it a background color of gray. Now you can see this container. Now you'll notice that the design for our web page has now changed, and quite dramatically so, because now our red square is a child of that parent container. And now it's defining its position relative to that grey container square. So if I delete that left 200 and instead I say right 20 pixels, it's no longer having a right margin of 20 pixels from the edge of the body, but it's now relative to its parent container. And even though our other squares are blue and yellow, are still relative to the body, because we haven't defined a vertical position for it, it's being pushed down by this element with a relative layout. So we can change this by giving it a top property of 0. And whenever you're using 0, you don't actually have to specify a unit like pixels or percent. And let's do the same for our yellow square as well. And let's push our red square over. And let's push our red square over so that it is right 0. And you can see that we've got exactly the same layout, but this time because red is nested in a container, we're using completely different code. And the beauty of this is that you can use containers to fine-tune the position of your elements on screen by using a combination of absolute and relative positioning. Now, the last thing I want to show you before we finish our section on positioning is I want to show you that last value, which is the fixed position. So for example, if I change the yellow's position from absolute to fixed, and I say that it is fixed to the top, then if I scroll through the web page, it will stay in its current position. Now, I can show you this if I create some H1s in here, just to give ourselves a bit more space so that we can actually scroll through our website. So I'm just going to copy and paste a whole bunch of these. So we've now got a whole bunch of H1s and we can scroll through our web page. And you'll notice that the yellow div stays exactly where it is, fixed in its position relative to the body of the website. And it doesn't move despite all my scrolling. So this is really useful if you have a nav bar that you want to be fixed so that it follows the user as they scroll through your website. Or sometimes you might have a sidebar that will stay fixed, and this is how you would do it. So that's all I wanted to cover for the CSS position property. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can further improve our website by using what we've just learned. Now, let's take a look back at what we've got on our website and see how we can use some of the knowledge that we learned about positioning in order to make this website look the way that we want it to. Now, the first thing that we want to achieve is we want to center all of these elements, the image, the mountain image, as well as the text here in the H1 and also this subtitle. So the easiest way of centering elements is by tapping into a property called text-align. And that property has to be set inside the parent container. So in this case, either in the top container or inside the body. So I'm just going to go ahead and center everything on screen by tapping into the body selector and saying text align center. If we hit save and we head back and we hit refresh, then you'll notice that all of our images, our H1 and our paragraph is now centered. Now, this works as long as we've got an inline block element, such as our images, or if we've got these full width block elements, like our H1 and our P tag, which are going from left edge to the right edge. Now, if I go into my code and I change the H1 to change its width to say only, I don't know, let's say 10%, then you'll notice that it's no longer being center aligned, despite the fact that it's still inside the body, which is asking for text align to be center. So what do we do in this case? Well, the other way of centering an element is by using the margin. So there is a value called auto, which when applied will center the element either vertically or horizontally. So in this case, if we're looking for horizontal centering, then we can say that the margin top is 0, the margin right is auto, the margin at the bottom is also 0, and the margin on the left is again auto. So I'm going to delete this margin top here and hit save. And if I refresh, you'll see that our element, despite being only 10% of the width of the screen, is now centered in the middle of our web page. And when you look at the box model, you can see that the top and bottom margins were set to be 0 by us, and the left and the right are set automatically to whatever amount it needs to be in order to keep it in the center. So very often, when you're finding yourself trying to center elements, you'll probably end up using one of these methods. So just to recap, text-align center inside the container or the parent element will center everything inside that doesn't have a width set. Now, if it is a block element and it has a width set, then you're going to have to center it using this auto value in the margin. So in this case, we can also shorten this by saying that the top and bottom needs to be 0 and the left and right needs to be auto. And that will not change this at all. And this is just one of those circle shorthands that you will begin to learn. And if you've forgotten how that worked, or if you're interested in learning more, then you can always check out the CSS docs on MDN for the margin, where they go through each of these, where if you only have a single value after margin, then that's all 4 sides. If you have 2, then that's top and bottom, and left and right. If you have 3, then it's the top, left and right, and bottom. And if you have all 4, then that's just all 4 sides in a clockwise direction. So if you get confused or if you forgot how that works, then have a look over there. Now I'm actually going to undo and I'm going to revert back to margin top being 0 and text align being centered. And you'll see that this is what it will now look like. Now the next problem we need to tackle is that these 2 images are acting as if they are inline blocks. And the cloud, because it's in the flow of the HTML file, is affecting the layout of the mountain. More specifically, I want this mountain to be right in the middle, and at the moment it's being pushed to the right by that cloud. So in order to fix this, we have to take this cloud out of the HTML flow. And once we've done that, then the mountain will go back to being centered. So can you remember how we can take an element out of the HTML flow by changing one particular CSS property? That is, of course, the position property that we're going to change, and we're going to change it from its current value, which is static, to absolute. And that is how we're going to remove it from the HTML flow. So inside our index.html, I'm going to give a class to our bottom cloud, and I'm going to call it bottom cloud. And while I'm here, I'm going to give a class to our top cloud, and I'm going to hit save. We're going to head back over to our styles.css, and we're going to target that bottom dash cloud, and I'm going to set its position to absolute. Now, if I hit refresh, you can see that that cloud has been taken out of the flow, and it's kind of being placed more or less randomly on the screen. But more importantly, our mountain is now bang in the middle of the file, and this is exactly the layout that I want for it. So the next part is a challenge, and this is what you want to end up with if you manage to complete the challenge successfully. We've got our top cloud that's on the right and a little bit above the H1, and we've got our bottom cloud that's on the left and just between the text and the mountain image. And they are both taken out of the flow of the HTML document. So pause the video and give that a go now. Now, how did that go? So firstly, our bottom cloud at the moment has an absolute position. Now, in order to position it relative to something, one of its parents has to have its position set as relative. And if we don't, then it will be relative to the body. So in our case, I want us to be able to position our bottom cloud relative to this entire top container. So I'm going to set the position of our top container to relative. And I'm going to start off by giving our top container just a little bit of padding at the top so that we can push down this cloud and all of these contents just down by a little bit so that it's not all stuck at the top of the page. So to do that, we can add a padding top of 100 pixels. And that just pushes everything down a little bit. And then I'm going to add our top cloud as well. And I'm also going to take it out of the flow by changing its position to absolute as well. And now if we hit refresh, you can see our two clouds are kind of just floating around without doing very much. So now let's position them properly. So relative to our top container here, I want the top cloud to have a right margin of 300 pixels and a top margin of 50 pixels. And I want our bottom cloud to have a position left margin of 300 pixels and a bottom margin of 300 pixels from the bottom of its parent, which is of course the top container. So it will be from this line. And if we hit save and refresh, then this is what we will end up with. Now, before we do any further positional tweaking, we should really format the text, because by changing the font size, etc., we're going to affect the positioning of our elements as well. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can style our text using CSS. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, one of the most important decisions that you will have to make when you're designing your website is what are the fonts that you're going to choose. And a lot of web designers will start off by figuring out a color palette as well as a font scheme. So in this lesson, we're going to learn about how we can change the fonts for all of our text in our website. Now, there are two major font families, and that is the serif and the sans serif fonts. So you can tell serif and sans serif fonts are apart from each other by looking for these little feet at the edges of all of the letters. And these little feet are called serifs. Now, we can broadly define whether if we want a sans serif or a serif typeface for any text on our website. So let's go ahead and do that. If we go into our style sheet and we change the font family property for our body, then we actually affect all the text on our web page. And you can see that there's 5 major families listed here. Now, only 3 of which are you actually going to use. So we've seen serif and sans serif. Now, monospace is when each of the characters inside the text take up the same amount of width. And that's usually a typeface that we use for coding because it makes everything super easy to read. For example, if this word align was styled in a serif or sans serif typeface, then the I would be squished right next to the L and the G. But because all code is represented in a monospaced font, then you can more easily read each of the letters. So you'll use these two for your normal website styling. And when you do have code on your web page, sometimes people like to style it using monospace. Now, cursive and fantasy are 2 families that you're never really going to use. Firstly, because they have low readability, and secondly, because they generally don't look that great when used in the body of a website. So cursive is meant to be handwritten style of fonts, and fantasy is meant to remind you of Avatar, basically. So let's take a look at what each of these families look like. So let's first define a font family of serif, and let's head back over to our website and we hit refresh. You'll notice that nothing happens. By default, we already have a serif family. You can see that at the end of the eyes, we've already got these little feet. Now, if we change that to sans serif, however, we will get a noticeable change. And those little feet or those little serifs now disappear and we have a different style. Now, for most browsers, the default serif is the Times font and the default sans serif is Arial. And this is the Arial font. Now, if we changed this to fantasy, then it will still work. It just now looks like I'm producing the next Avatar. So let's head back to a sans serif typeface. And I'm not really satisfied with just an Arial font. What if I want a different sans serif font? Let's say that instead of Arial, I would rather have Verdana as the font for my website. Now, what I can do is, instead of specifying just the sans serif broad stroke family, I can add a specific font or typeface in front. For example, if I wanted the Verdana font, then I can simply type Verdana and then have a comma and then separate that from the sans serif family. And now if we head back over here and refresh, you can see I'm now using the Verdana font. And what this line of code does is that it sets the font family for all the text inside the body, but it first asks the browser to try and render all the text in the Verdana font. Now, if for some reason the browser or the operating system that the user is using doesn't have this font installed, then it will default to whatever is the sans serif font that is installed on their system. Now, that's a little bit scary because that kind of means that I might think that I've designed my website to look like this, and I think it looks perfect just like this. But on somebody else's system or browser, they might be getting a completely different style with different font heights and just a different look and feel. So there is such a thing called web-safe fonts. Now, what this means is that there's a set of font families where most operating systems will be able to render it correctly. And for the serifs, that includes Georgia, Times New Roman. For the sans serif, that includes Arial, Comic Sans, Impact, etc. Although these are called web-safe fonts, and it's basically saying that if you choose these sets of fonts, then you have the maximum chance of getting it rendered correctly as you're seeing yourself when you're designing it. But actually, no font is 100% web-safe. And if you head over to cssfontstack.com, then somebody has actually painstakingly listed all of the fonts that are in common usage and what is the percentage of users who have it installed separated by their operating system. So as you can see, the font that most people have is Arial. So 99.8% installation on Windows, 98.7% on the Mac. Now that is really, really high. But for some other fonts, you'll see a difference between the Mac and the Windows operating systems. And we're not even including Linux users here. So for example, if you look at something like Helvetica, which is an Apple-specific thing, then on Windows, installation rate is really, really low. And on Mac, it's 100% because it comes pre-installed with all Mac OS. So what can you do if you want to use a font, but you're not sure if everyone has it installed, right? For example, if I want to use Helvetica, then there's only 7% of users on Windows who are going to see it rendered in that font. Well, then you would need fallbacks. So if we click on this little icon here on Font Stack, then we actually copy a set of fallbacks for this Helvetica font. And if I go ahead and paste that and replace our font family, then you can see that we have a stack of fallbacks. So I'm basically saying that I want the font family to be Helvetica Neue if they have it, and if they have an Apple system, then it's very likely that they will have this font installed. If they don't have it, then default to the next best thing, which is Helvetica. And if they don't have that, then default to Arial. And finally, just go with whatever sans serif they've got installed if they don't even have Arial, which is very unlikely. But you can see how we're going from specific to less specific, and all the while ensuring that we're getting roughly a similar sort of typeface and similar sort of feel, no matter which fonts the user have installed or not installed. So if we hit save and we go back to our website, then you can see that on the Mac, I do indeed have Helvetica Neue installed, and that's what's currently being rendered on screen. But say if I was on Windows, then I might be seeing Arial in this case. And you can go ahead and give it a go and have a look at these font stacks and copy them over to your webpage and see what you're able to get. Now, what if we were even more picky as designers? What if I really want everybody who looks at my website to see exactly the same thing as I designed it? I want them to see the design that I intended instead of whatever font it is that they happen to have installed. And for example, if I was using Helvetica, then pretty much like 93% of Windows users are just going to see Arial. What if I really hate Arial? What can I do to ensure that everybody has the same viewing experience with regards to the fonts on my website? Well, you could use something called font embedding. So if we head over to fonts.google.com, then you can see that they've got a whole bunch of font families that you can choose from. And these are all fonts that are free for commercial use that you can simply embed into your website. And there's a large choice of font families that you can pick through. So you can choose whether if you want just serif fonts to look through or sans serif. They have these cool articles about which fonts go well with which, and a whole bunch of really, really useful stuff actually. But in my case, I already know what it is that I want. I want the font called Merriweather. Now, before we search for that font here, we're going to make sure that if you did apply a filter, like here that I have, looking only for the sans serifs in the fonts, then you make sure that you just click reset so that we can find all types of fonts, and then we can search for Merriweather. And we actually want this one, not the sans serif type. So let's go ahead and click on it, and then you can take a look at what it looks like. It's got who designed it, what the purpose of this typeface is, and you can also see how your sentence would look like if you decided to change the text. Now, while we're here, we're going to go and find the regular 400 point size font, and then we're going to go ahead and click plus to select the style and add it to our list of selections. Now, I'm going to go ahead and add a few more different fonts before I show you how we're going to incorporate this. So the other one that I'm going to pick up is a handwriting font, actually. It's called Sacramento, and this I'm going to use as the font for my H1. So a very stylish sort of font where we don't really need people to read it that clearly. So it's not like a body font where it would be quite painful to try and read through, 300 words that are all styled like this. So let's go ahead and add that too. So we've got now 2 selected. And the last thing that I want is my main heading font. And that is going to be a sans serif. And one that I'm quite partial to is the Montserrat. So I'm going to go ahead and add that as well. So now I've got 3 font families selected, and I can embed it into my website as easily as copying this link and pasting that at the top of my index.html. Just going to paste that link in there, and this specifies a location where if users don't have these fonts already installed or cached on their system, then the browser will take them to this location and grab those fonts for them. And then if we go into the style.css, then I can specify a font family that I want to use. So the one that I want for my body is the Merriweather font, and I'm going to paste that in here, and it will default to serif if something terrible happens, say the internet connection went down in the middle of downloading the font, etc. But you can see it's not a large font stack because in pretty much 99.99999% of the time, this is the font that everybody is going to see because we are embedding it instead of presuming that people already have it. Now for my H1, I'm going to use the Sacramento. And for my H2 and also H3s, I'm going to use the Montserrat. So let's go ahead and put those in there, and let's just hit Beautify to rearrange everything. And let's hit save, take ourselves back over to our website, hit refresh, and voila. Our text is now beautifully styled using the fonts that we chose from Google Fonts. So feel free to have a mess around with the different fonts that you might like or you might want to incorporate to your website, and then simply add them to your selection, include the link in your index.html, and start using them in your CSS like so. Now, in the next lesson, I want to go and do a deep dive on different fonts and different typefaces. What are the different families and how they came about? So just a lesson on one of the most crucial parts of digital design, and that's, of course, typography. So if you're interested, then that is what you will get on the next lesson. If you're not interested, then you can feel free and go ahead and skip ahead to the next lesson where we explore some of the other font and text properties that we can use to style our text on our website. So I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in order to continue styling our text and to change the text properties and learn about different ways of styling our text, then we actually need a little bit more content than just these 2 lines of text. So let's add the rest of the content to our website. Now, if you look inside the resources for this lesson, then you will find a download link where you can get the stub code that I've created for you. Now, once you download it, then you can right-click and open it using Atom. Now, this is what I've created for you, and it's basically just the structure of the rest of our website. Now, what I want you to do is just to copy the entire file and then paste it into your index.html, and you're going to replace your middle and your bottom container, but nothing else. So as you can see, the stub code includes the middle container as well as the bottom container. So we're just going to wholesale put that into your current index.html, and you're going to replace these bits of stub code which I've placed in here. Now, for those of you guys who might be interested in what all of this means or what it is that I've put in here, what is all this mumbo jumbo, it might be good to explain to you. This is something that is used quite frequently in web design. It's used to place text paragraphs in a website before you have any content. And if you go to loremipsumgenerator.com, you can actually find a little bit of history about what all of this is, where it comes from, and how it came to be used in a lot of website styling and web design. So take a look here if you're interested. But basically, you can generate these bits of text that don't really mean anything other than to look like normal English words of different lengths, and you can use that in your website to take up space that your text content is going to go. So you can generate, say, 1 paragraph or 5 paragraphs, and there's even other generators where you can get more specific than that. For example, you can have 4 sentences or specify the number of words. You can say if you want short, medium, or long sentences, and it will generate it for you as well. So that's pretty useful when you're creating websites and you haven't yet got the content for the text yet. Now, the other parts that you will have to update in here are the image sources and the image alt tags. Now, the first image here is for your profile photo, so a picture of yourself, or, if you don't want a picture of yourself, then put any picture you like. And these other images are for your skills that you're going to describe in your skills section. So you can go ahead and add a source to those images too. And at the bottom here, we've got a button that is going to open the default mail app to an email address of your choice. So that could be your contact email. And finally, in the last section, we've got 3 links that go towards any site that you wish. So that could be your LinkedIn profile, your Twitter profile, your website. So go ahead and change all of these links in there to whatever it is that you want, and change this to your name so that you have a copyright at the bottom of your page. So go ahead and paste all of this stub code inside your index.html and update the lorem ipsum and also change the images. Now, once you have done all of that, I want you to go ahead and delete all the code that's inside your middle and your bottom container inside the CSS file. And once you're happy with your content inside your index.html, including all of that stub code, and you've gotten rid of those styles inside the middle and the bottom container in your style.css, then once you refresh your website, this is what you should roughly have. So the top section stays unchanged, because we haven't touched it at all. But you should have a profile picture of yourself, a greeting word. You could leave the hello there, or you can change it if you wish. And you've got a little brief bio about yourself. Then you've got the section called My Skills, which is going to have 1 image that is going to represent your first skill, whatever that may be. And then you're going to find another image that is going to represent your second skill, whatever that may be as well. Now, if you're short on images for that section and you couldn't find any in Google that you liked, then take a look at this website called flaticon.com. Here, they've got more than 500,000 vector icons, which you can search. And some of these are really, really cool. For example, these little profile ones, or you can search for something like computer, and you've got these really nice packs that you can use free for commercial use as long as you give adequate attribution. So then if you have a look at each of these icons, then you can download them as a PNG in whichever size you would prefer. And you can insert those into your web page as a relative URL. Now, if you happen to find a nice looking image on Google, or you found an image of yourself, then you can simply get the URL by just right clicking and copying the image address and pasting that into the source on your website. Now, if you wanted an image that was an animated GIF, perhaps, then a good source is to head over to giphy.com, and you can search for something that you want to include. And if you select the sticker tab, then you will get these transparent GIFs which will look a lot nicer on your page because your background color will go all around it instead of it being just a square or a rectangle. And finally, at the bottom, you've got a contact me link that takes you to whichever email that you would prefer to be contacted by. And you've got your social links at the bottom that go towards wherever you want it to. So this is the rest of the content for our website. And for the remaining lessons, we'll be styling this content to make it look more and more like a professional personal site. All right, so now that we've got all of our content together, we can go ahead and style all of the text that we've got on our website. So in this lesson, I'm going to cover a number of font properties so that we can further style and make our website look the way that we want it to. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the font size. And to begin with, I want my H1 to be a lot bigger than my H2s and my H3s so that it really stands out as the title of this front page. So let's head over to Atom and implement that change. So inside my H1, I'm going to tap into the font size property, and I'm going to set the font size to 90 pixels. So this is the equivalent of selecting 90 in the drop-down menu when you're selecting a font size. And now if I hit refresh, then my title is going to get a lot bigger and it's going to fill most of that top page. Now at this point, make sure that you're not zoomed in or zoomed out and that your browser is at 100% zoom. And you can check this by just going to zoom in or zoom out, and you can see whether if you're on 100% or 110%. So we want it to be 100% so we can see what everybody else should see by default. Now, currently, our font size is set to be 90 pixels. So on certain browsers, if the user goes into preferences and they change their default font size for their web page, for example, if they need super large text in order to see, then you'll notice that font size does not change, even though the rest of the text does. And this is because this is not a dynamic size. So in order to make it dynamic, there's two options. So let's head back over here and just go back to the medium size. And if we go into Atom, then instead of using pixels, instead we can use something like a percentage. So 100% in terms of font size is actually a 16 pixel size. And so that means if we want 90 pixels, so that means 90 divided by 16, and that would be equal to 562.5, then we would need 562.5% in order to get the equivalent of 90 pixels. So if we hit save and we go back to our website and I hit refresh, you'll notice that absolutely nothing happens because we're specifying exactly the same font size, but instead we're using a percentage this time. So that means that if we go into, say, preferences and we change our font size to very small or very large, then that font size will scale with it. Now, the other way of specifying a dynamic font size is by using a unit called the EM. For example, if we head back onto our favorite website, techcrunch.com, and we highlight this title here and we inspect it, then if you select this H2 here, you'll see that it's got the class called live title and its font size is specified as 2EM rather than however many pixels they want it to be. Now we've seen EM before inside our HTML and we used it as a tag in order to emphasize a particular section of text, and that stylistically means that it'll make something italicized. Now in this case, this is actually a completely different EM. And the EM in this case is actually the phonetic pronunciation of the letter M. And the reason is because in typesetting in the olden days, the EM, or the M rather, is the width of the capital letter M. And so that means that when you say 1 EM, then you want the font size to be 1 times the width, the capital letter M. And if you want 2, then that's double the size of the M, etc., etc. Now, in modern days, this is no longer true. But what is true is that 1 EM or 1 M is 16 pixels, as we've seen with our percentages. So 16 pixels is equal to 100% when you're talking about fonts, and it's equal to 1 M or 1 EM. And that means that you can achieve whatever size you want dynamically using either of these methods. So for example, as we calculated before, 90 pixels is equal to 5.625 EM. And so that means that if we replace our font size with that number, and we hit save, and we go back to our site and we hit refresh, then you'll see again the font size does not change because they are all the same. It's just using different ways of specifying the same size. So then the question you might have is, why would you use one over the other? What does it matter? And if you look on different websites, for example, take uber.com, and if we inspect on their title here, then you'll notice that their font size is specified in pixels, whereas on TechCrunch it's specified in EMs. And on other sites you might get percentages. Now, as we mentioned before, if we change the font size, for example, say somebody with accessibility issues, to very large, then these static sized fonts do not change. It stays exactly the same size. Whereas the things that are dynamically sized, for example, things using EM or percentages, they do scale up so that users who have maybe visual impairments, etc., who might want to have a higher font setting, will be able to view the website more comfortably. And that's quite important in terms of making your website accessible to everybody. Now, the argument against that is some web designers say that people with visual impairment these days are more likely to zoom in rather than changing their default font size. And they're more likely to have a higher zoom in order to read all the text on page. And with zoom, it doesn't actually matter whether if your text is statically or dynamically sized, because it will just scale up the website depending on what you're asking it to do. So maybe that's not such an important distinction between statically and dynamically sized fonts anymore, but there is one thing that is really important. And that's the fact that when you're using EM or when you're using percentages, that value is inherited. So if I go into the body here and I specify a font size for everything inside the body, so that's everything on my website, to be, say, 2 EM, and then in my H1, I leave my font size as the previous dynamic size. I hit save, and let's head back to our website and we refresh. Then you'll notice that our H1 has now become absolutely gigantic. And that's because the font size gets inherited and added on top of whatever it got from its parent. So the parent of the H1 is the body here, because it's contained inside the body. And in the body, we said that font size should be 2 EM across the entire body of the website. Now, when it gets to the H1, it's already got that 2 EM applied, and then it adds that 5.625 on top of the 2 EM, which is why we end up with something so gigantic. And this is exactly the same with percentages. So if I said, say, 200% in our font size, and I change this to 562.5%, then again we still get this gigantic font size. But say if I said, the font size should be 20 pixels, and over here it should be 90 pixels, and we go over here, we head back and we refresh, then you see that that font size is staying as 90 pixels. It does not matter what its parent's font size was, because these are static sizes. So that means it can get a little bit dangerous. For example, if you wanted all the text inside your body to be 200%, which remember is 2 times 16 pixels, which is 32 pixels, now that works fine until you get to a point and you forgot that you did that, and over here you ended up setting your 5.625 EM or your percent, and then all of a sudden, oh, what's going on? Why does it look like this? And you have to go and debug and try and figure out, where did it get this font size from? So for example, we can inspect in our Chrome developer tools and you see, okay, so it's got font size 5.625, that's what I want, but do I have any font sizes anywhere else? And here in the body, even though it's crossed out, that 200% is still being applied. So in order to avoid this, one of the things that we got in the latest version of CSS, which is the version that we're using currently, or the version that I'm teaching you about, is CSS 3. And inside CSS 3, there is something called the REM. And that refers to the root EM. So that means ignore all of the parent settings for the font size and just set it to this relative to the root. So that means that it doesn't matter what we've done here or in its enclosing containers or parents, it will be 5.625 times 16 pixels as long as we add the R in front of the EM. So if we hit save and we head back over to our website, hit refresh, then you can see that we still get that size that we wanted, which is the 5.625 REM. So the beauty of the root EM is that it does not get affected by upstream size changes. And it means that it's easier to debug and it's less likely that something will go wrong. So when sizing text, my personal recommendation to you is to use REM instead of EM or percentages or pixels, because that is the most adaptable and also the most reliable and least error prone. So now if we head back over to our site and refresh and also change our font size in our preferences back to the medium that's recommended, then you can see that we've got the exact size that we were looking for, which is the same as the 90 pixels that we specified. But this is done using REM rather than EM or percentages. Now, here's a challenge for you. We want to change the size of this part which says a programmer. Now, at the moment, a programmer is inside a paragraph tag. Now, we've got several other paragraph tags on this page, so we don't want to change the size of all of them. So first, I want you to change this element from a paragraph element into an H2 element. And I want you, as a challenge, to set the font size of the H2 to be equivalent to 40 pixels. But I want you to do that using REM. So pause the video, go ahead and see if you can figure it out. So that's pretty easy to calculate. So our target is 40 pixels for the font size. And we know that 1 EM is 16 pixels. So we can simply divide 40 by 16 and we end up with 2.5. So it'll be 2.5 REM in order to achieve the equivalent of 40 pixels for the font size of our H2. So let's go over to Atom and implement that. So inside our H2, let's go ahead and set the font size to 2.5 REM, hit save and refresh, and voila. We've now got a much larger subtitle and heading by changing the font size. So if that was confusing at all, make sure that you rewind and rewatch some of the parts where we spoke about dynamic font sizing and how it all worked. But now there's just one thing that I want to change about the layout of this website. I would love for this H1 to have a little bit more padding from the top so that it gets pushed down more towards the center of the page. So we can do that by simply adding a 50 pixel margin to the top of our H1 rather than having it as 0 pixels. So let's go into Atom and change the margin top to 50 pixels. This is what we end up with. Now, with margin top and padding and all of those other things where we specify a size, you can also use the EM, the REM, or the percentage values. But in this case, I actually prefer to stick to using pixels because it's more precise and it's much easier to see what's going on when you inspect it in using the box model. So that's just a personal preference and it's a stylistic choice of your own. So if you want to use REM or EM or percentages, that's absolutely fine as well. And it works exactly the same way as we mentioned with the font sizing. So basically, as long as you insert a 50 pixel equivalent margin, then we should end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Now, there's one more thing that I would like to change here after we've specified our font sizes, and that's to have a little bit less space between the H1 and the H2 here, because at the moment, if I hit inspect, you can see that the H1 has a significant amount of margin before and after, and I would just like to get rid of that bottom margin. So instead of specifying the margin top, we can just specify a margin using the circle shorthand. So we start off with the top, which is going to have 50 pixel margin. Then we go to the right, which I'm going to keep as auto to keep it centered. Then we get to the bottom, which I want to be 0. And finally, we have the left, which I'm going to leave as auto as well. Now, if we hit save and we head back and close down our Chrome developer tools, and now we hit refresh, you can see that we've got a little bit less space between the H1 and the H2, and it just looks a little bit more put together. Now, these are all minor tweaks, and it's totally up to you if you want to implement them or not. I'm just adjusting it to my eye. Now, in the next lesson, I've got a number of challenges for you, and I want you to use the developer docs on MDN or on W3 Schools in order to figure out what these properties are and how you should set them. But you should be fully equipped in order to discover some of these other font-related properties that I want to talk about. So head over to the next lesson and complete the challenge. All right, so how did that go? Well, the first thing that we wanted to change was the font color. And we've actually looked at this before, but if you don't remember, it's always a good idea to head over to Google and simply say font color CSS. And if you prefer MDN or W3 Schools, then just enter that as well. And the first thing we get is the color property, which sets the foreground color value of an element's text content. So that is pretty much what we want, right? And we can set it using this particular rule using the hex code that I provided. So let's head over to Atom, and inside our H1, let's set the color property to that hex code, which was 66BFBF. And we wanted to do the same for our H2. And for our H3, we wanted the color property to be set as 11999E. So now let's hit save, and we can already see the previews of our colors, which is roughly what I expected. So now if we head back to our website, hit refresh, our website is starting to look very, very nice now. And we've styled some of our titles to the colors that we were looking for. So the next one we were looking for was the font weight. So let's search for that and see what we get. All right, so we've actually got a property called the font weight, and you can see there's a whole bunch of ways that you can specify the weight. For example, the keyword values or the actually numeric values. So in our case, we actually wanted the keyword normal simply in order to get rid of this bolding here and to de-emphasize this subtitle. So let's head over to the H2 and let's go ahead and add our font weight over here. And we wanted to set it to normal. So hit save, hit refresh, and there we go. Now it's a little bit lighter in its weight and it looks just a little bit more together. And we've gotten rid of that pre-specified font weight, which was determined by our browser, where it set it to bold. So now the next one is the line height. So let's go ahead and set our line height for our H1 over here. So line height, we can specify it using a number. So 1 would be the default and 2 would be double height. Now, the important thing to remember about line height is that the preferred way of specifying line height is to give a single value without any units. And in our case, we're going to change it to 2. So let's hit save and let's see what that looks like. So that will increase the space between whatever is on top of the text of the H1 here and whatever is below it. Now, in my case, I don't actually really like the way that looks, but if this more spaced out look is what you like, then feel free to keep it this way. But I'm actually going to get rid of this after we've shown exactly how it works. Now, our website is coming along really nicely, and feel free to tweak around the layout or the positioning of any of the elements that you see on our front page here and make it look the way that you want it to. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to learn about the final positioning system, which is floating. And we're going to use what we learn in order to position our skills blocks to make it look much nicer than the way it looks right now. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now we're getting really, really close to the end result now. And all we need to do is start getting our skills section laid out in a way that looks a little bit better than this. So the first thing to notice is that if I switch on pesticide, you can see that we've got the skill section, and inside the skill section, there's 2 divs. And if you look in the code, then you'll see exactly the same structure here. So this div is the skills div, which contains 2 further divs, which are the skill rows. And if you prefer to visualize this a little bit easier by seeing which is the opening tag for the div and which one is the closing one, you can actually head into Atom and change your preferences in your editor section to show the indent guides. So now you can see that you've got these lines that show you which div matches with which closing element. Now, I actually prefer this off just because I find it too cluttery, but it all depends on how you wish to visualize it. But the important thing is that we've got these two divs that represent two skill rows. And I want you to make each skill row have only 50% the width of the screen. So at the moment, it's 100% because it's a block element, but I want you to change that to make it only 50%. So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so this shouldn't be too hard. If we head into our styles.css and we go ahead and add our skill row, and just make sure that you check to see if you've got any typos between the way it's named here in the class attribute and the way that you've targeted it over here. So we want to change the width to 50%. And we can hit save and refresh, and you can see that even though our width for the div is now 50%, because it's no longer 100%, it's no longer centered in the middle of our website. So how can we fix this? We've seen this before, and as a challenge, I want you to restore this skill row to the center of the web page. So pause the video and see if you can figure out how to do that. So as we've seen before, the way that we achieve this is by setting the margin to be auto on the left and on the right. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can set the margin for this skill row to be auto, and that just means auto on all four sides, which will center it if we refresh our web page. Now, at the moment, that div is a little bit too close to the top heading and to the next div. So how can you change the margin property so that we end up with a 100 pixel margin at the top and a 100 pixel margin at the bottom, but keeping this margin auto on the left and right? Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so this goes back to the circle shorthand. So if we start from the top, as we always do, we're going to add a 100 pixel margin at the top. Next, we come clockwise to the right, which we want to keep as auto. Next, we go down to the bottom, which we said, again, we want 100 pixels margin. And finally, we have the left, which we are going to set as auto. So the left and the right are auto, the top and the bottom are 100 pixels. Let's hit save and let's refresh, and we can see that margin now in action. Now, the next thing that I want you to do is I want this text, both the part for the design and development, as well as the description text, to be left aligned. So can you figure out which property you need to change and where in order to make that happen? So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so all we need to do is to go into the skill row and change the text align property. Remember, we changed this previously to make the text center aligned for most of the body, and that in itself aligned the images to be centered as well as all of our text. But in this skill row here, we want the text to be left aligned. So we can change that value to left, and that will override the center text align in the body. So now if we hit refresh, you can see that our text inside the skill section is now left aligned, but outside of it, it's still center aligned. Now, the next thing I want to do is to make the paragraphs, so the text in here, a little bit more spaced apart by changing the line height. So can you double the line height by changing the line height property? So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so in this case, we're again going to be inside the skill row, and we're changing the line height property to 2. And remember, in this case, we don't actually have any units, and we're simply specifying a scale. Let's hit refresh, and you can see that our text is now a lot more spaced out and much easier to read. Now, the last thing I want to do before we look into the positioning of our skill row is we need this image to be a lot smaller. So go ahead and change the width of the image to 25%. All right, so in order to target the image, we need to specify their class names. So one is called code-image and one is called chili-image. Now, this is just the classes that I've added for my own images. You might have named these classes differently because you might have different images. Just check what you have as your class name before you start implementing this and make sure that it works. So I'm going to cluster that with the other images, and the first one is called code-image. And I want to change the width to 25% of its parent. And the next one is the chili image. And this again is going to have a width of 25%. Let's hit save and let's refresh. And you can see that they are now the same size, even though they weren't before, because they're now scaled down based on the width of their parent, which in this case is actually the skill row. So it's now a quarter the width of the skill row, which itself is only 50% the width of the entire page. So now comes the really interesting thing. How can I make my text wrap around my image? So I want this skill row to be a lot stouter, so less in height, and I want this image to be on the left, but I want my text to be on the right of the image and wrapping around the image as necessary. Well, this is where the topic of this lesson comes in, and that is, of course, floating. So we can make the image float to the left of the text and make the text wrap around it by simply changing one property, and that is the float property. So if we go into our code image and we change the float property to float left and we hit save, once we refresh, you'll see that our image is now on the left of our skill row and our text is now wrapping around the image in order to display both of these on the same line. Now, it looks a little bit odd having the text right up next to the image. So can you figure out a way of having 30 pixels of space between this text and this image? So pause the video and see if you can complete the challenge. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You can think about padding or margin. In this case, in order to apply a margin to the text, it would be kind of difficult because they're completely separate at the moment. We've got an H3 and we've got a paragraph. Now, you could add a div to wrap them together and add a left margin to that div. But what's much easier is to simply add a margin right to our image. So let's head into our code and change the code image margin right property to 30 pixels. And once we refresh, you'll see that our image now has a bit of space between it and the text, because it's wrapping around and now it has less width to be displayed, it's actually taking up the full width of that div, and this looks a lot better than previously. Now, as a challenge, I want you to use the same principles of floating to make this image appear on the right over here, and for the text to wrap around that image and to have the same amount, so 30 pixels of space between the image and the text. So pause the video now and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so pretty much the same principles here, but in this case, we're not floating left anymore because we want it to be on the right of the text. So in that case, we have to change the float property to right instead of left. And that will mean that the text will wrap around the image on the left. And then we just have to add in that margin left of 30 pixels on the image in order to get it to have the same amount of space as we had up here. So this is looking pretty sweet, and we're getting very, very close to our end result that we're looking for. Now, sometimes when you float an element, you might not want all of the text to be wrapped around it. So, for example, say if we only wanted that title to wrap around this image and to be on the right of the image, then we can actually use another property to make sure that this text does not wrap and end up at the bottom over here below the image. And that property is called clear. So if I target the paragraph here, and let's give it a class, let's call it maybe code skill description. And I'm just going to copy and paste it down here. And if I use the clear property to clear its left side, then that prevents it from wrapping anything on the left. So let's go ahead and try that. Clear left. Hit save, refresh. You can see that that paragraph is now pushed to below the image, which is floating. But that heading, that H3, is still wrapping around the image that's floated to the left. If you think about clear as almost like the anti-float, then that starts to make a little bit more sense. So we're saying that float this image to the left and all text will wrap around it on the right. But for this paragraph, we said to clear its left, which means make sure that that left margin is clear and not wrapped around anything. Then that basically prevents it from carrying out the default behavior. Now, as a challenge, can you make this paragraph appear below this image rather than wrapped around it? Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so it's exactly the same concept here. Now, let's go ahead and just give that paragraph a class. Let's call this chili skill description. And again, I'm going to copy it, save the file, and paste it down here. And of course, remember that dot in front because it's a class. And in this case, I still need to use clear, but I have to clear its right side in order to make sure it doesn't wrap around the image. Because you can see that if I tried the same thing and I cleared its left side, nothing changes because it's not wrapping anything on its left. But if I change this to right, then you'll see that it now appears below the image and it's prevented from wrapping the image that's floated to the right. Now, I'm actually going to go ahead and clear both of these CSS rules because I actually prefer the look that we had previously, and I'm going to get rid of these classes as well. And this is the final result that we want to keep. Now, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. Float is one of the most commonly used and abused CSS properties. The thing to remember is that it has a whole bunch of corner cases, and I recommend to only use float when really, really necessary, and only use it for what it's meant, which is wrapping text around a certain element. And don't use it for positioning. Instead, use what we learned about positioning, like relative or absolute positioning, or using the margin and the padding for the layout and the positioning of your website, and to leave the float property only for the cases of wrapping text. Then you will surely get into less trouble and less problems than if you try to use a float just as a sort of free-for-all layout property, which you see a lot of people mistakenly do. Now, looking through the Q&As, one of the issues that students often have is that their design is not being laid out correctly like what you see on screen. And one of the most common reasons is because they're using different text, more specifically a different length of text. So here you can see there's quite a lot of text, and based on that, our CSS styling is making it appear like this. But if you had only one sentence or only a few words, then you might see the images being slightly out of place. Further, if you display this on a larger screen size, or if you actually just grab the corner of your browser and you toggle it around, you'll see that as you shrink or expand the browser, your design is going to break and it's not going to look like it should, as you see here. Now, the reason for this is because our website is not yet responsive. And I'm saying not yet because in the coming lessons, when we learn about Bootstrap, when we learn about more advanced CSS, then we're going to be able to fix this problem and make our designs look the way we want it to in all screen sizes and in all dimensions. So don't worry too much about that if you're having trouble fixing the layout. Just try to make sure that you're using the same content for your index.html as we have here in the lessons, and try to make sure that you've got your CSS code matching, and it should look right on most screen sizes. We'll need to toggle it a little bit. So we are really, really close to the end of this module. And in the next section, I've got a challenge for you to look at a specification of how we want the website to be finally laid out. And instead of me guiding you step by step through all the little properties that you need to change, I want you to figure out what you need to change in order to achieve the layout that I've specified. So in the next lesson, you'll see text instructions for you to complete the final big challenge and get this website looking beautiful. So for all of that, I will see you on the next lesson. All right, so in the last lesson, there was a PDF that you could download, which showed the end result of our website. And it shows how things would be laid out, what is the rough spacing between each of the elements, and how everything should look and feel. Now, I've also specified the hex codes for the colors that I'm using here, and I also showed you how you can go about getting hold of this button code. Now, in this lesson, I'm going to show you how I implemented this, adding in the rest of the CSS code that we need to achieve this look. Now, it might just be that your code, based on what you estimated visually, is a little bit different from what I'm going to type. That's not a problem at all. Now, you can either follow along with what I'm doing in the solution, or you can simply watch it just to see if you got the broad strokes right. For example, how did you implement the horizontal rule, or how did I get this bottom footer section to look like this? Now, it doesn't matter if your website looks similar to mine or not. In fact, I encourage you to personalize your website, but I want you to be able to achieve the layouts that I've specified. So after you're able to look at a specification like this, now I admit this is a very rough spec and I haven't given you the specific margins and paddings, etc. But it's a great skill as a web designer to be able to look at a sketched out layout or a mock-up and to be able to implement that in code inside your CSS and HTML. So let's get going, and feel free to follow along with me or just watch the solution video to see how to do something that you couldn't figure out. So the first thing that I'm going to change is that I'm going to change the body text color to a slightly off black, and that's the color I specified here, 40514E. So let's head over to our body and let's add that font color here. So that's going to be changing the color property, and it is 40514E, and that's this sort of dark grayish color that we're going to implement for the text inside our website. And that just makes it look a little bit more designed than previously, but it's still highly readable. So be careful about using really light grays when you're changing the body color, because if there's not enough contrast with the background color, then it can make it really difficult. Not just people with visual impairment, but even normal people. It'll be a strain on their eyes. So always go for something dark and high contrast. Now, the next thing that I want is to have a little bit more padding between the H2s and the text below them. So for example, I want just a bit more space between the hello and this bio, and also the my skills and the skills section. So let's head over to our H2 and add that padding bottom. And I'm going to add only about 10 pixels to achieve that. So you can see the effect is really subtle, but it helps to space things out a little bit. Now, the next thing I want is a bit of space between the middle section and the top section. So I'm going to add again 100 pixels of padding to the top and 100 pixels to the bottom to space it out between the middle, the top, and the bottom containers. But I don't want to add any further margin to the left and right. So I'm going to leave it as 0 so that it's stuck to the left and right sides of the viewport, which is the screen. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the shorthand where I say it's 100 pixels for the top and bottom and 0 for the left and right. So let's hit save and refresh. You can see we've now got a good bit of space between the top and bottom containers, and that looks a lot more natural than before. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I want to format this little bit of bio here so that it's less in width and you can have a few more lines rather than this long line that's quite hard to read. And so I can do that by changing its width. So if I go into my index.html and I already have this class for that paragraph, which is called intro. You might have called it something else, or you may or may not have this class. Just check to see what you called this class over here, and then we can target it inside our styles.css. And I'm just going to put it below the pro class. So it's called intro. And I'm going to change its width to only 30% of its parent container, which is, of course, the middle container. So let's hit refresh, and you can see it's now a lot less in width, and it's now taking up 3 lines, which is much easier to read rather than one long big line. So, but the problem is now it's left aligned and it's no longer in the center of our web page. And that's because it's no longer edge to edge, and we now have to set the margin to auto in order to get it to be centered in the web page, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and add a margin property and just set it to auto on all 4 sides. And now you can see it's perfectly centered and it looks a lot nicer than before. So one of the things I added here was to make the line height double what it used to be, and that spaces out the text and makes it a lot easier to read. Now I'd like to do that consistently across my website, so for the intro as well as the other parts of text. So instead of having that line height down in the skills row section, I'm actually going to cut that and add that to a paragraph level CSS rule. So I'm targeting all the paragraphs inside my website and I'm changing all of their line heights to double the height that it used to be. And this makes it a lot more spaced out and a lot easier to read. Now, finally, I just want to adjust my clouds a little bit, just based on what I prefer it to look. So I'm going to change the top cloud to have 40 from the top rather than 300 to make it go up a little bit. And then I'm going to make the bottom cloud only have a left of 250, so make it go further to the left. All right, so that is pretty much the top sections done. Now the next thing we need to look at is this horizontal rule, and at the moment it's looking a little bit ugly, but as we did previously, we managed to get these little gray dots to show up as the horizontal rule, separating the sections instead, and that's what we want to do here also. So let's go ahead and target the horizontal rule. So remember, because it's a HTML element, we're going to put it with the other HTML elements. And we're going to first change the border so that it has a dotted style. And I'm going to change the color to a light gray, so an EAF6, F6. And I want it to be 6 pixels in width. So let's refresh that. Now you can see that there's now 2 borders, one above and one below, and enclosing a 0 pixel height horizontal rule. So if we now go and set the border bottom to none, then we can get rid of that bottom border to only have a single line, which looks the way that we want it to. So the next thing is to change its width, and I want it to be a lot narrower than that. In fact, I want it only to be about maybe 4% of the width. And it's important to use percent here so that it scales when my website scales. And finally, I need to give it some margin because at the moment it's far too close to everything else. So I want it to have 100 pixels of margin top, 100 pixels margin bottom, and I want it to be centered in the middle. So we're going to go for that good old margin property, and we're going to say top and bottom should be 100 pixels and left and right should be auto, so that we keep this centered in the middle. And that is looking really, really nice. And I know it's a very, very light color, but it's fine because it doesn't need to be red. It's just there to visually separate some of our sections. Now, the next section that we get to is, of course, this contact me section. And the first thing I want to do is similar to this intro or bio bit of text, I need to make this contact me message a little bit less wide. So let's target that and change its width. So the contact message currently has a class called contact message. So let's go ahead and target that inside our CSS. So dot contact message, and we're going to change its width. And I'm going to change it to just 40% in this case. And that will make it go onto 2 lines, but it will also make it go to the left. So let's change the margin so that we have 40 pixels from the top and 40 pixels from the bottom, but the left and right should be auto. Now, the shorthand way of specifying that is by using the 3-element circle rule. So that's 40 pixels from the top, auto for the left and right, and 60 pixels for the bottom. Again, if that confuses you at all, make sure you take a look at the MDN developer docs for the margin property. So hit save, and we've now got more margin here than here, and it's also spaced so that it's automatically centered in the middle. Now, the final thing in this section is, of course, changing that contact me button from this horrible, ugly looking thing to something that looks a little bit more like a real button. And as we mentioned in the challenge, we're going to use the CSS button generator website. So the text I'm going to change to contact me, all caps. The font family will leave as Arial for now. The font color is just going to be white. And the font size we're going to leave as 20 pixels as well. Now, we're not going to change anything in the box, but we are going to change the border, and specifically that's the border radius. I'm going to change it down to 8 so that it's a little bit more square looking rather than rounded. And it's not going to have a border, but it is going to have a gradient background. And the starting color for our gradient is going to be 11 CDD4, and the end color is going to be 11999E. And for our hover or rollover state, we're going to start the gradient at 30E3CB, and we're going to end at 2BC48D. All right, so now you can see that when you hover over it, it's a little bit lighter to shade of green. So that looks pretty nice to me. And this is the automatically generated CSS code based on all of those options that we've selected. And we can now just copy it wholesale and paste it into our CSS over here. Now, if you take a look at our anchor tag for our contact button, you can see it has a class of BTN, and that matches perfectly with the class that we get back from CSS3 buttons generator, and that means that it will be able to target it without a problem. Now, the only thing that I want to change here is I want to change the text so that it fits in with our font family that we've set for the entire website. So I'm going to change the font family from Arial to Montserrat. And now if we hit save and we go ahead and refresh our page, then you can see that we've got that beautiful button that we've implemented without very much work at all. All right, so now we're finally ready to tackle the bottom section, which is basically our footer that you'll see on most web pages. Now, the first thing that we want to do is we want to change its background color so that we can see the difference between the footer and the middle section. So find the bottom container and let's go ahead and change its background color to the color that we've been using for a while now, which is 66BFBF. And let's hit save and refresh. You can see we've now got this bottom section highlighted and separated from the rest of the content. Now, why is there this gap between the bottom of our page and the bottom of our footer? Well, the reason, if you inspect, is that you can scroll it all the way up to the top, and if you hover over that paragraph for the last copyright message, you can see that it's got a pretty large margin, 16 from the top and 16 from the bottom. And remember, that came automatically from the user agent style sheet, which comes from the browser, and that's 1 EM top and 1 EM bottom. So we have to either get rid of that padding, or we can pad out our footer a little bit more and make it a little bit taller so that it encompasses that padding for the paragraph tag. I'll show you what I mean. So if we go into our bottom container and we change the padding to 50 pixels up top, 0 left and right, and 20 pixels at the bottom, then that should be more than enough to cover the 16 pixels, which is the 1 EM padding for our paragraph. So if we hit refresh, you'll see now our footer goes all the way down to the bottom, and there is now enough space for that padding to be included inside the footer rather than outside the footer. So next, let's style our anchor tags. Currently, they're a little bit too squished up together and it's not looking very nice. So let's go ahead and target them by targeting all of the anchor tags. And let's first change the text color to what we have in the rest of our document. And the text color that I specified was 11999E. And let's add the property, of course. And let's hit save and refresh. You can see that we've now got a slightly lighter color than before. but it's still relatively readable against the background. Now, you can of course make that contrast more if you wish to, but I usually think that the text in the footer, you don't want it to distract from the main message, which is either contact me or whatever it is that you want to highlight to people. So I want to have that a little bit more muted. Now, let's make this text look a little bit more in line with the rest of our text. You can see that the anchor text is actually styled in a different font from the rest of our text. So we can change that to what we've got for the rest of our body, which is Montserrat, by just copying this line over here. Or, as you probably should to get more practice, just type it out. So let's update that, and we've got something that fits in with the overall look and feel of our website. And now all we need to do is just space them apart a little bit so that they can be easily distinguished from each other. So to do that, we're going to have to add a little bit of margin to it. And I'm going to add a 10 pixel top and bottom margin and a 20 pixel left and right margin to give it more space away from each other. And this way we can click on each one individually without having them all mushed together. Now, the final thing that I don't like about this look is that by default, all anchor tags have an underline that shows you that this is clickable. Now, I want to show that in a different way by changing the hover state. So I want to get rid of this underline. And I can do that by changing the text decoration, which, remember, the browser automatically makes it underlined for all anchor tags. And I'm going to change it to none. So now we update that, that's gone, and that looks a lot nicer, and it doesn't look like a 90s website anymore, right? So as we said, we want to show that these links are clickable by making it have a different color when I roll over it. So I can target that using the hover state of the anchor tag. And if you remember that we spoke about these pseudo classes a few lessons ago, and if you're confused about this at all, then be sure to check out those previous lessons on the CSS selectors. So for the hover state, instead of having a font color of 11999E, we instead want to have a EA F6, and that will just be a little bit lighter so that when we hover over it, it looks like it's definitely clickable, and that gives the user enough clues as to what to do with it. Now, the very, very final thing that I'm going to format is the copyright here, and I'm going to change its color to make it less assuming and also make it a little bit smaller. So let's go ahead and see what we used for that copyright message. We used the class copyright. So let's go into our styles.css, find the part where we have the text, and let's go ahead and select the copyright message and change its color to the same as we had for our anchor tag rollover state, which is EA F6. Hit refresh, you can see it's now this lovely light white color, and then we're going to make it a lot smaller. So we're going to change the font size to 0.75 rem, so that's 75% of 16 pixels, and it's now less important and it's taking up less space as well. Now finally, I want to give it a little bit more padding from the top and the bottom, so I'm going to change its padding to maybe 20 pixels top and bottom and 0 pixels left and right, so that it goes all the way to the end. And that way it's got a little bit more separation from the top, and this looks a lot nicer than before. So that's all the changes that I had to make in order to fully recreate our specification here. Now, if you had any problems such as implementing the buttons or changing the horizontal rules, then be sure to try and fix it using this solution. Now, at this stage, if you're happy with everything that we've spoken about, feel free to go ahead and completely change or personalize this website, change the color schemes, change the layouts to whatever it is that you prefer. But this is the live website, and the next step is, of course, make it hosted on GitHub so that your personal site is live and you can share it with your friends and your family, or show it to anybody who might want to employ you. So that's all for this section. But in this module, we learned a lot about CSS and styling and positioning and layout, changing the text, changing the colors, making text wrap around images, how to create hover states, and loads more. So if any of this is not apparent immediately, it might be worth reviewing some of the more difficult concepts, for example, the positioning and the difference between absolute and relative. Or you can simply just go ahead and start creating a web design of your own fancy that you've designed pencil and paper and try to solve those problems by doing. So that's all from me in this lesson. I'll see you on the next lesson.
Hey guys, today it's Angela and the Office Crayfish. The Office Crayfish and I would like to congratulate you on getting this far. So well done for completing the last module, and we're both really proud of you. Now today I want to talk about something that I've heard students say a lot, and it's this idea like maybe I'm not cut out for programming. Maybe I just wasn't born with a particular brain that it requires to think in this way. Maybe this is just not for me. And why is it that so and so they just pick it up like that? Why are they just born to do it? And what I want to say to that is nobody is born to have a certain skill, right? Or there's a lot of things that require a lot of dedication to be able to achieve the result that people get. You just don't see it, that's all. Now, you never see a baby just being born, it's all really muscular, right? That doesn't happen. In order to get muscular, in order to get strong, you gotta go to the gym. You gotta put in the reps. Nobody can help you with that. No matter how rich or how privileged or how smart you are, if you don't go to the gym, you're not going to get stronger. And it's the same with a lot of other skills. With programming, I would bet that there is no one programmer who you can find who hasn't done the work. You don't just show up on your day one and you're like, wow, I know everything. That doesn't work. And in most cases, people often hide the hard work that's required in order to get to where they are. If you think about the game Pokemon Go, do you remember that from a few years ago? How it just blew up overnight, and literally everybody who was walking around was playing Pokemon Go, I swear. And the newspapers were saying oh, overnight sensation Pokemon Go, and it's the creators stumbled upon some sort of pot of gold. But actually, do you know how many other games that Niantic and the founders of Niantic have built before that? How many have failed and how many were just kind of meh, until they had this big moment? We don't see that, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, right? So in order to get good at something, you gotta show up, you gotta put in the hours, and then you'll get the results that you deserve. And in fact, if you suddenly just win the lottery and you get something that you haven't really worked hard for, you don't really cherish it. If somebody gives you a gift and you didn't have to work hard for it, it's not the same as the thing that you worked a whole summer for, washing dishes. I certainly remember that. That thing that you buy is so different from something that somebody just gives you. So put in the work, put in the effort, and the results will happen, I promise. And I'm here for you, and I'm here cheering you on. I believe in you, and I think you're going to do great. So just keep going.